What I think we want to explore this morning is why the opinion polls got the 2015 UK election so spectacularly wrong, and what can be done to rebuild trust and confidence. In particular, is there any particular issue about obtaining accurate samples in the age of mobile? We might also ask ourselves, are there any other implications for market research more generally, and whether other tools for aggregating information, such as betting markets, prediction markets, can help? First, I'd like to turn to the head of political research at Ipsos Mori, one of our leading opinion pollsters, Gideon Skinner, and ask him one question. The final Ipsos Mori poll on election day itself was published in the Evening Standard. It gave the Conservatives a 1% lead over Labour. In the event, Conservatives beat Labour by about 7%. The Ipsos Mori survey of registered voters said that 82% were certain to vote, although Gideon did say that was likely to be an overestimate, and he said it would probably be between 72 and 74%. In fact, it was 66%. So, where did things go wrong, Gideon? And what have we learned since?
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. Anyone who wants to leave, the doors are exits. Performance of the polls in 2015. I suppose I can only really... There's a few points I need to make before I get into the detail. I suppose I can only really talk about our polls at Ipsos Mori, and in fact there was a fair amount of range in terms of what the different pollsters were saying, and some of the solutions that we come up, they might work for us, but they might not work for some of the other pollsters. So that's point one. Point two is we're still actually in the process of going through our review, and we're obviously also still waiting for the inquiry by the British Polling Council to see what evidence they can find. So I'm sure what I tell you now is not going to be the final word on the matter. And John, I'm sure, can provide much more thoughts across the piece on that. Yes, finally, just clearly, it was not a great performance by the polls. We've got to recognise that and be humble about our performance and make sure that we can come up with convincing reasons why we got it wrong and how we can improve in the future. I mean, at the same time, we weren't wrong on absolutely everything, but I won't go into that now because it's more interesting to talk about what we got wrong. And for us, the key issue, or at least one of the most obvious issues that we do have to look at, is the point that you raised about turnout.
Yep.
So, whilst we had only a 1-point Conservative lead, which was clearly not right, actually our Conservative vote share it was low, but it wasn't. It was within margin of error. It could have been better. But the biggest thing that we got wrong was the Labour vote share, which was too high, which was overestimated. And the thing that we are focusing on at the moment is the extent to which the thing we got wrong was turnout and overclaim of turnout, particularly amongst Labour supporters. And the key point on this, before I'll finish and let John have his piece, is that the difference between 2015 and 2010, and indeed in previous elections, is we always know we get overclaim on turnout. And so we've developed models that worked not perfectly, but okay in previous elections in 2005 and 2010 in getting the shares. And these models didn't work in 2015. And the prime reason why they didn't work was because we found that Labour supporters were much more likely to say they were going to turn out. So the differential between actual turnout and claimed turnout, we know that there's some, but the differential increased amongst Labour supporters. And if we compare the results we got from 2015 and 2010, we can see that quite clearly. So we have to ask ourselves, why were we finding this overclaim of turnout amongst Labour supporters? Was it that we were just getting too much enthusiasm amongst Labour supporters, and that they were liked the idea of getting rid of the Conservatives and putting Labour back in, but actually when it came down to it, there were concerns around maybe Ed Miliband or the SNP or Labour's economic credibility that meant people didn't turn out to vote, or that the types of people that Labour appealed to were exactly the groups who tend not to vote. And Labour had real trouble with older voters and middle-class voters, which our data suggests, if anything, even swung to the Conservatives. And these are key groups in terms of turnout. So that's what we've got to focus on. I mean, there may be other issues that we might want to look at to see if it's is it about question wording we can improve? Is it about sample coverage? Just briefly back onto the original point of this, when we include mobile sample in our sample, it helps us get young people, young men in particular, but broadly it doesn't seem to make a big difference to the final result. So although including mobile sample helps, it's certainly not the answer to this particular question. But that's what we're continuing to focus on. I'll leave it there.
Okay, so and John Curtis is our leading polling expert probably in the country. He's president of the British Polling Council, and significantly he headed up the exit poll on election night. Now that wasn't perfect, but it was a lot better than the polls before the election. I wonder if that tells us anything as to what happened, because the exit poll was of people who had actually voted, not people who said they were going to vote. And I wonder if that explains something. But John will know better than me.
Okay, I probably need to make a quick personal statement before I try to answer the questions. I'm billed as president of the British Polling Council. The British Polling Council is the organisation that, along with the Market Research Society in the UK, has set up the inquiry into what went wrong with the opinion polls. As president of the organisation, I am not a member of that inquiry, and anything I say in the next 30 minutes or so is entirely my personal view and should not be taken as either the view of the British Polling Council, let alone giving you any indication as to what the inquiry is saying. The inquiry is wholly independent. It consists of people who have nothing to do with opinion polling, but are experts in statistics and survey research more broadly. And I frankly have no idea at all as to what conclusions, if any, they have yet reached. That said, inevitably because of my interest in the subject area, I've looked quite a lot across the piece at what the polls were doing and why they might have gone wrong. And in particular, I have had access to the data from one of the exercises that many companies have engaged in, which of course is to go back to the people whom they interviewed before May the 7th, the date of the general election in the UK, to find out what they actually did. So some of what I'm going to say is informed in particular by having poured through that data. Now, again, maybe we should just gain a little bit more background in terms of what we're talking about here. On average, we had about 10 opinion polls that you could reasonably regard as being final opinion polls. That is, their fieldwork dates ended no more than 48 hours before polling day. And on average in those polls, they put the two largest parties in the UK, Conservative and Labour, at 34% each. And thereby were pointing pretty firmly to a hung parliament, though nobody being quite sure who's going to be ahead. In the event, we ended up with the Conservatives 7 points ahead. And because, of course, in the United Kingdom we have a first-past-the-post electoral system, even relatively small errors, the kind of errors that, frankly, if you're doing market research, you won't care tuppence halfpenny about, when it comes to trying to tell people what's going to happen in terms of what the House of Commons is going to look like, can soon be pretty fatal. As Gideon has already said, the misfortune of the pollsters, they got all the small numbers right. They got the Liberal Democrats right, even though Liberal Democrats never believed them. They got the SNP, who won virtually every constituency in Scotland, got half the vote in Scotland. They got that more or less right. They got support for UKIP, the insurgent anti-European party that arose during last parliament. They got that right. They got many things right, but the thing that people were most interested in, and the thing which is most sensitive to actually getting an accurate portrayal of the political implications wrong. But you do need to realise that, for those of you who come from countries that have proportional representation systems, you're probably going, 34, 34, 37, 31. Well, yeah, bit unfortunate, but not that serious. In our context, it's absolutely serious. So I think it's worth understanding that. The second thing to understand, where Gideon and I may depart slightly, is that the truth is that the error in the polls in 2015 is not isolated. if you look at the record of the opinion polls since and including 1992, which is the last time when, as it were, the outside world decided the polling industry had got it wrong, and indeed I had the misfortune to sit on the inquiry into what went wrong on that occasion. The truth is that at most elections, with 2010 just being a partial exception, there has still been a tendency for the final opinion polls to overestimate the Tories and underestimate Labour. But, for example, if you've got an election as in 1997, where the winning party is, whatever it is, 13 points ahead of the second party, and they've got a majority of 176 in the House of Commons, nobody notices if you kind of said it was going to be 16 points rather than 13 points. Who cares? So the truth is also, opinion polls get judged by different standards depending on how close the race is. But I think, therefore, certainly one of the reasons, in my view, why we needed to have an inquiry is that, in a sense, although the polling industry in the UK is a completely different animal from what it was in 1992. In 1992, remember those days before the internet, before mobile, well, there were just about a few mobile phones kicking around, but, they were about a brick size. It was still basically face-to-face quota sampling. It was virtually how all opinion polling was done. We then, since then, been through two revolutions. One is the revolution of random digit telephone dialing to do opinion polls, and since then we've gone through, or at least we're going through, a revolution towards online internet polling. All the online internet polling here, by the way, is to non-probability samples. There isn't anything like knowledge networks in the USA or its equivalent in the Netherlands. So, but despite those, and the 2015 election was the first election at which the majority of polls were conducted via online rather than by telephone, though the truth is they both ended up in the same boat so far as getting it wrong is concerned. So it doesn't seem to be a simple issue of mode. But it does therefore mean that, the industry has kept on having much the same problem, even though its methodologies have been radically changed, certainly once and in many cases twice. So that I think is important for you to understand as the background. Now, why might the pollsters have got it wrong? And I'll just go through this very, very quickly, and then maybe we can go into some of the detail more. I think there are essentially 5 possible explanations kicking around. They're not wholly independent of each other, but they're worth separating out. One is what Gideon's already spoken about, which is lazy Labour. This is the idea that Labour voters were particularly differentially less likely to vote, and crucially, that the opinion polls failed to pick this differential up. Now, I'm happy to go into whether that's true or not later on, but that's explanation number 1. Favourite theory number 2, which is actually something that was also certainly a problem for the pollsters in 1992, is the so-called shy Tory theory, and this is that basically, kind of slightly exaggerate, it looks as though there's a group of Tory voters out there who regard opinion polls as a left-wing conspiracy, and as a result, they're not willing to tell pollsters what they were going to do, but actually when you go back afterwards, you discover they went off and voted for the Conservatives. And so therefore, the estimates are wrong because, in effect, the don't knows and the refused are differentially centre-right Conservative voters. The third explanation, which in a sense is the explanation the pollsters would love to be correct, but because they were polling so late, is unlikely to be correct. And the truth is that, with one exception, all of the recall exercises suggest it's not correct, is of course late swing. Well, we stopped polling at 6 o'clock on the day before polling day, and then all of a sudden the sword of Damocles came down, and people changed their mind, and they had a Damascene conversion, and they decided to vote for the Conservatives the following morning. The truth is that does look very unlikely. One other theory that's been out there, that's been promulgated, again, probably looks as though it's not right, is an issue of question order. One of the features, certainly of the 2015 election, was that some of the underlying numbers for the Labour Party kind of did not look very good. Their leader, Ed Miliband, was not very popular. They were not regarded as particularly economically competent. And it has been suggested that if the opinion polls had kind of asked people those questions first, and then asked what they were going to do, that maybe they would have got rather closer to what people actually thought, rather than asking them first, so what are you going to do, and then asking them about Ed Miliband and economic competence, and then kind of only realising after they've already said they were going to vote Labour that perhaps it wasn't such a good idea after all. There has been an academic exercise which, as it happened, had a split design. with lots of people being asked how they were going to vote in the beginning of the survey, lots of people at the end, no difference. So that theory is probably out. The final one, and this in a sense is the one that the pollsters would like not to be true, but I certainly don't think at this stage we can rule out. And that is that at the end of the day, the samples that opinion polls are getting are not up to the task of being able to estimate vote choice correctly. And certainly it doesn't matter what mode you are doing. You can see some of the issues involved in trying to do opinion polling in a relatively short fieldwork period, often no more than a couple of days, in virtually every single opinion poll. Virtually every single opinion poll, even though now, for example, the telephone polls include the mobiles, and in theory at least you could answer an internet survey down your mobile phone as well, all of them have too few young voters. I mean, they just cannot be got hold of. Even if you ring them up on their mobile, you still don't get hold of them. The second, and equally, it's virtually every single opinion poll in the UK is too middle class in its sample composition. Now, all of these opinion polls are attempting to overcome this with the standard techniques of weighting, etc. But obviously, it raises a question: if indeed, you're only getting something like 2/3 of as many young people as you should get, are the young people you are getting necessarily typical of all young people, and therefore, as a result, are you in trouble? And this can, in fact, feed back into the so-called lazy labour problem, that actually the reason why you're not getting the turnout right is actually because the samples aren't right in the first place. But I'll stop there.
Okay. Do you have any response to that, Gideon?
No, I mean, I agree with John that those are, they're all the areas that we want to be looking at. I mean, I think the ones that we're certainly things like late swing, much as we might love it to be true, it's not obviously looking like that. I think question order is different, but as John is interesting, but as John says, what work has been done on it doesn't seem to make a great deal of difference. The tricky bit is how, certainly at least for us, shy Tories, doesn't seem to be so much of an issue, if only because the level of turnout that we get implies a slight overclaim on Conservatives anyway. So we get slightly too many Conservatives anyway. So it feels to us like it's turnout, and particularly for Labour, but clearly that could be related to sampling as well. It's just very difficult to pinpoint exactly what's driving it.
So I'd like to pick up on this point. The exit poll was a lot more accurate than the polls before.
Yes.
Why is that, do you think?
Because it uses it's a completely different methodological challenge. It uses a completely different methodology. And I don't think, to be honest, there is any read-off at all from the exit poll to opinion polls. I can happily go into, I don't know if you want another lecture about how we do exit polls in the UK, but standing outside polling stations, asking people what they're going to do is a very, very different exercise from trying to get hold of people by one method or another and asking them what they're going to do. The short answer, I mean, I can expand if you want, but the short answer to you is that I don't think there are any lessons to be learnt at all from the exit poll as opposed to the opinion poll. The exit poll, not for the first time, came up with results that are somewhat different from the expectations of the opinion polls. And touch wood, we ended up still being closer than everybody else.
Okay. The internet, mobile, telephone, different pollsters use different methods. And at one time it was face-to-face. The question is, which of these is the better method, or should every pollster do a bit of all of them? Either of you.
John's point about 2015 is right, that there was no obvious difference between internet samples and telephone samples. I think in 2010, telephone pollsters did better overall. There are challenges with both. There are challenges with telephone in terms of the response rates and so on. There are challenges with online in terms of not being a non-probability sample, being opt-in panels. One of the differences that we did spot during the campaign, at least, was that online panels tended to get higher levels of UKIP share. Telephone polls tended to get lower levels of UKIP share. So there are some differences. I don't think at the moment the answer is not one is definitively better than other. We still do telephone because we still think overall, on balance, the advantages of telephone outweigh those of internet, but we do lots of online polling on other topics, and we're always looking at ways of improving our online sample. So there's clearly other advantages that online have, so it's not a definitive final say on that.
I ask you more generally, which might be of interest to the audience. Does the problems that Ipsos Mori and other pollsters had in forecasting the outcome of the election, or in representing what the state of the parties was at any point in time, does that give a problem that people might think, well, do we really believe what Ipsos Mori's surveys say about anything else, not in politics? What do you say to the audience about that?
Well, I'm probably... Again, thanks. It does, and it's a rubbish answer, but it does and it doesn't. Clearly, we get responses from clients who are concerned about the results in terms of it clearly has it is a showcase for us. We do not do opinion political polling to make a fortune by any stretch of the imagination. It's half interest, and we've got a strong. It's part of our culture, and we've always done it, and we think it's fun and exciting most of the time. But it's also partly us putting ourselves out there and saying, look, this is what we can do. So yes, clearly it has a reputational impact. And so that's why we have to get our response right and to be able to come up with explanations and show the lessons that we've learned. I think many of our clients, perhaps they're more familiar with research and the challenges of research, and so they can understand some of those reasons and lessons, so we can explain them. I mean, I don't think post an election, you particularly, if you look at the market research industry's overall volumes, they neither go up when we get it massively when we get it right, nor go down when we massively get it wrong. So we must be able to convince people in other ways, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with that. I think there's two other points to make. I mean, one is the pollsters are always giving themselves a really tough test. I mean, this really is something where, they publish something and within a matter of hours, definitively whether they've got it right or wrong or not. Whereas on the other hand, if the pollsters tell you that, you could potentially claim 1/3 of the market in soap powder, and you don't get 1/3 of the market in soap powder, they can always blame you on the grounds that you failed to do your job properly. There isn't the same definitive. I mean, one, two, it is as already suggested, particularly in the UK, it is a really, really tough test. I mean, again, certainly if you have any sense as a consumer of research, if somebody says to you, look, you currently look as though you might potentially have 1/3 of the soap market, well, it's kind of roughly in that territory. Actually, the real figure might be 37%, or it might be 30%. But unless you are really operating at the commercial margins, that shouldn't be making much difference to you. What you really want, it will tell you whether you're at 33% or at 16%. Right, territory, and if that's what you're interested in, frankly, the opinion polls again would have got you in by that standard. Will have all got you in roughly the right territory. So that's the other thing to realise. That said, I think the reputational damage is, it's always potentially serious, and to that extent, and it's certainly also, given that opinion polls do potentially affect the political process, and we've seen a perhaps very striking example of that in the UK in recent weeks, and I'll just say a little bit about that. It is rather incumbent on opinion pollsters to try indeed to get it right, because putting out misinformation or inaccurate information into the political process is, from a democratic perspective, not very desirable. The one more recent example, whereby, I mean, the opinion polls spot on once you interpret them correctly. YouGov, one of the internet companies, did 2 opinion polls of people who were eligible to vote for the Labour Party leader, who, if you're not aware, is now a left-winger called Jeremy Corbyn, until they did their first opinion poll. Nobody knew that Jeremy Corbyn was actually ahead in this race. Everybody assumed he was a no-hoper. Now, it may well be true that in that particular instance, that information, which we now know with the benefit of hindsight was probably correct, may well, however, have had a fundamental impact on that race, because once people realised that Jeremy Corbyn was capable of winning, and given that applications to be eligible to vote in this election had not closed, almost undoubtedly this encouraged people who thought, the Labour Party might finally going to change, I can vote for Jeremy Corbyn, coughed up their £3 or their 30 quid or whatever it was they wanted to do to join the Labour Party, and added themselves to the electorate. So, but again, therefore, it was absolutely crucial that actually the information YouGov were putting out was correct, because otherwise, clearly that's a rather striking instance where polling information could actually affect the outcome.
Gideon?
Yeah, and I just want to go on to one other point actually about why we do political polling, which hopefully is of relevance to you in this room, which is that, for us, we're judged on our final campaign poll, but when we're carrying out our polling and our political research across the campaign and more broadly, it's not just about the sort of the headline figures, the horse race figures. It actually gives us an opportunity to test a whole range of different types of methodologies, because there's lots more interest in it, and it gives us a bit more scope to kind of try new and different things. For example, we carried out an online community using mobile as a way of delivering a number of questions and engaging respondents for the BBC. Which was a great test of a kind of a different type. This is not something that's trying to predict the final results in a sort of traditional quantitative way, but it's a way of engaging a community, 2,000 people over the course of the campaign, asking them in detail what they thought of the key issues, engaging them with sort of online forums, having kind of snap polls on particular issues, going into certain kind of policy issues in a lot more detail. You could have a survey to them, and then an online forum, some things people could take part on their mobile, they could send in photos, we could have chats and all sorts of things. So there is a further benefit of political polling that actually allows us to test some of those methodologies and kind of test them in a real, as John said, a real sort of the white heat of having to get it right, which hopefully can then benefit the rest of the industry.
Okay, so the last thing I want to ask, it's interesting because I happen to be director of the betting research unit as well as director of the political forecasting unit at Nottingham Business School. And I use betting markets and I publish papers to forecast elections. And they have an extraordinary level of success. They're very, very, very good. They weren't as good this time, but they were a lot better than the polls. But generally, if you can just look at the polls of the betting markets are better. But that's because the betting markets have access to the polls. So I want to ask you, is it a contest, or is this a mythical thing, that betting markets and polls are complementary?
Of course they are. I mean, and if you're going to make betting markets, if you're going to do a real test of whether or not people punting their money are more successful in opinion polls, then you have to find a group of people and shut them in a room for 5 weeks and deny them access to any information about opinion polls. And of course, there's no way that you can do that. Certainly, again, going back to the Labour Party leadership race, there's a very nice graph on YouGov's website which shows very, very clearly that the betting market moved in the wake of YouGov's 2 opinion polls. But more broadly, in fact, I mean, there's also a quite interesting paper, I mean, admittedly by a group of people who got their forecasts wrong, so they're kind of trying to commiserate themselves a little bit. But that said, they have done a test of not just the accuracy of the betting market with respect to the outcome as a whole, but the outcome in each of the 632 constituencies in Great Britain. And basically they said, well, we got it using opinion polls and fiddling with them a bit 90% of the time, and the betting market got it right 90% of the time. So it's basically a draw between the two. Because the truth is, in most cases, it's very, very easy to forecast who's going to win a constituency in the UK because most of them are safe. So to that extent, at least, it's not the strongest test. I think that if truth be told, the most active political betting website in the UK spends most of its time telling you what the opinion polls say, and then uses that information together with the prices in the market. I never understand this stuff, but they use the two pieces of information then to identify what looks like a good bet. But the truth is, they're relying on the polls tremendously for this process.
But just put it in perspective, 3 days before the election, the betting markets had the Conservatives 6-1 on to win the most seats in the election. 6-1 on, £6 to win one.
I think you'll find many an opinion poll would have given you the same answer. Actually, one thing I looked up, something that Danny Blanchflower said, which I found out, is that actually the median forecast on Betfair for the Conservatives, at 12 o'clock at midnight on the morning of polling day, was 288. So the median expectation on Betfair was well short of what happened as well.
In terms of the overall majority, that was unexpected. Yeah. But for the Tories to win significantly more seats than Labour was hot favourite in the betting markets for months.
Yeah, sure. And the truth is that's also true of most of the forecasting exercises that were based on the polls.
Well, the polls had them level in votes.
In votes, but not necessarily in terms of seats. And then it comes down to some extraordinary complexities of the first past the post system. But many a poll-based forecast, including from pollsters such as Peter Kellner, were actually saying, you know what, we know our polls have tended to overestimate the Tories in the past. I'm actually going to allow for that. So again, I mean, one of the things to realise in all the arguments about, both about the opinion polls and forecasts based on the opinion polls, it's not as though people in the industry or people who were trying to forecast were unaware of these issues. Most of the attempts, and there are a whole load of attempts to try to use opinion polls to forecast, took into account, the polls tend to overestimate the Tories in the past. Equally, most polling companies, they either didn't have to deal with the shy Tory phenomenon because they don't have many people not telling what they're going to do in the first place, because that depends on whether or not, it depends on how you ask the voting intention question in the first place. But those for whom it was an issue, they were attempting to try to deal with the shy Tory issue, and for the most part what they were doing was reasonably right. Again, differential turnout by Labour supporters, nothing new about that. And herein, whereas I probably depart slightly from Gideon, the truth is that some final polls had quite a substantial expectation of differential turnout, others did not, and certainly, ICM, which is one of those that did, actually the differential turnout, at least amongst those who were successfully recontacted and said what they did, the differential turnout that was anticipated in advance is what appears in the final poll. Now, of course, that still leaves open the possibility that it's the folk that you didn't get hold of that where the problem arises. And certainly one reason why it may have been more difficult to get Labour right this time because of turnout is that one of the things that happened between 2010 and 2015 is that the relationship between age and voting preference strengthened. The Labour Party gained ground quite substantially amongst young voters. They lost ground amongst older voters, but of course younger voters less likely to vote, therefore differential turnout could be more of a problem. But that takes us back to the sampling problem rather than necessarily a particular failure of Labour voters to tell you in the first place that they're not going to vote.
So I think we've come back to where we started in a way, and we've covered a lot of ground, but we just don't have enough time. We could do this for another 2.5 hours. Well, I could anyway. But I've been told that I have to wind it up. Is that right? If you want...
An answer to that the very last point that you were saying about the age. If you're not contacting enough young people or not enough young people are participating.
Well,
What's the answer? That's going to continue.
Oh, sure, absolutely. No, that's why if it's sampling, it's it's the crucial issue. And again, it raises. One of the arguments that came out of the last time the pollsters had trouble in 1992 was an argument that essentially says, you're trying to do opinion polls too quickly. And that actually, if you spend a longer fieldwork period, you're more likely to get a representative sample. Now, that kind of research perspective clashes with the news values of journalists who assume that 95% of the population follow the news with the same degree of earnestness that they do, and that therefore, if it wasn't something that's been done since the very latest supposed important political development, it's today's fish and chip paper. That's the clash that exists. But I mean, clearly, the longer you spend trying to gather a sample, other things being equal, the greater your chances of getting back. Of course, what's also true, there's money is an issue here. All right. Well, I mean, most purchasers of opinion polls are newspapers. Newspapers in the UK are a declining industry. Only around half of the population now regularly read a newspaper. So therefore, they are constantly looking for the cheapest way of getting a headline rather than necessarily the most perfect piece of political research.
Question, Aaron. This is Aaron Reed from Sentient. Different kind of question. I'm wondering what consideration, if any, has been given to the inclusion of implicit measures in your political polling process? And if it hasn't been considered or trialed, what do you think the obstacles are?
You mean indicators of things that that will anticipate behaviour more accurately, such as turnout? Yes.
Quantitative, non-conscious measurement.
You'll need to elaborate for me.
Assessing what people feel, essentially a quantitative measure of System 1, their automatic associations with different candidates, how that might be incorporated in with your conscious polls.
So do you mean things like when you're you're just asking for quick flicks on that type of experiment? Where
something more scientifically precise, but in that vein,
exactly, yeah. We've tried. Again, it slightly depends on what the purpose of the research is. So we have tried it as we're a big international country. We've tried it in a couple of places. It depends exactly what you're using those types of tests for. Are you trying to come up with? They can tell you. So far, I think we found that they can tell you interesting things about how people react to different candidates, the images that people have of different candidates, and the qualities that they appeal to. It's harder to, which is a very useful piece of information to have, and just as useful as the kind of the horse race stuff that the media is always sort of focusing on. But it's harder to use them in the sort of the traditional, to kind of work out a way of converting that into a sort of traditional opinion poll way of being able to sort of say, well, the Conservatives are on 37% and Labour on 31%. But it's quite early days in terms of what we can find out with that.
So it's early, interesting insight, but no formal way of refining likelihood of voting for a candidate.
I mean, part of the answer to you is that the relationship between people's evaluations of either leaders, candidates, or parties, and which way they vote, isn't a constant. I mean, it's the same problem with the attempts to use econometrics to forecast elections. We know that, broadly speaking, there is a relationship between the state of the economy and whether or not people are likely to vote for the incumbent government. But the detailed form of that relationship tends to vary over time. Therefore, it becomes rather difficult to say, well, okay, what I need to do is to ask these questions, and if I ask these questions, I can use a model that will then enable me to predict what the behaviour will be. That relationship is rarely sufficiently stable. It may well always be in a similar direction, but it's not necessarily sufficiently stable that you can use it to model.
Irene's turned me into the pantomime bad guy because I've got to come and tell everybody that we need to cut this conversation short, which is a real shame because I think we could keep on going for some time because it's so fascinating. Got an amazing amount of respect for what these guys do. I suspect there's not many of us in the room who do this job and then 2-3 days later have your homework marked by the entire country. As was mentioned earlier, it's a lot easier for us, 6 months down the line, go, oh yeah, I said we'd sell that many widgets or that much soap powder, but you buggered it up with your advertising or something else went wrong, so it's a great deal of respect. So round of applause, I think, is deserved.